Welcome to this special event conversation with Antonio Muñoz Molina, member of the Royal Spanish Academy since 1995, Premio Planeta in 1991, Jerusalem Prize in 2013, and Prince of Asturias Award for Literature in 2013, Man Booker International Prize finalist in 2018, Prix Médicis étranger in France in 2020. Good morning or afternoon to those of you who are following us here from the US, Central and Latin America, and a very good evening to those of you tuning in from Europe, Africa, and Asia. And that's one of the advantages of modern technology. That's what's bringing us here today. My name is Richard Bueno Hudson. I'm the executive director of Instituto Cervantes in New York. Instituto Cervantes was founded, as you know, by the Spanish government in 1991 to promote the Spanish language and the culture of Spain and all Spanish-speaking countries. Instituto Cervantes is located in 90 centers across 45 countries around the world. It is my very privilege today to host the book launch of the English translation of Un andar solitario entre gente, published by Spanish Seix Barral and entitled in English, To Walk Alone in the Crowd, published in the United States by House of Books Farrar, Straus and Giroux, translated from the Spanish by Guillermo Bleichmar. The highlight of the event today is having with us none other than the author of To Walk Alone in the Crowd, worldwide writer celebrity, Mr. Antonio Muñoz Molina. Antonio Muñoz Molina was born in Úbeda, Spain, and he studied history of art at the University of Granada and journalism in Madrid. His first book, El Robinson Urbano, a collection of his journalism, was published in 1984. His novel El Jinete Polaco received the Planeta Prize in 1991 and again the National Prize for Literature in 1992. Muñoz Molina is the author of 13 novels. His books include Beatus Ile, 1986, El Tenebros, 1989, Los Misterios de Madrid, 1992, El Dueño del Secreto, 1994, Ventanas de Manhattan, 2005, and El Viento de la Luna, 2006, amongst others. In 1995, he was elected to the Royal Spanish Academy of the Language, its youngest member. Margaret Sayers Payton's English translation of Muñoz Molina's novel Sepharad won the Pen Book of the Month Club Translation Prize in 2004. He also won the Jerusalem Prize in 2013. Isabelle Guignon's French translation of Muñoz Molina's novel Un andar solitario entre gente was awarded the Prix Médicis étranger in France in 2020. Like a Fading Shadow was finalist in the Man Booker International Prize in 2018. As you can see, he hasn't wasted his time. He's providing us with all this amazing literature and all these expressions of creativity. Thank you very much, Antonio, for being so generous with the rest of us. Apart from being one of the most renowned writers in the Spanish language today, he has also been the executive director of this very house, the Instituto Cervantes in New York, between the years 2004 and 2006, and creative writing professor at NYU between the years 2010 and 2015. For this event, we will be accompanied by writer and professor Edward Stanton, who will take on the tough challenge of interviewing Antonio Muñoz Molina. Edward Stanton was born in Colorado and raised in California. Edward Stanton has lived in Mexico, Argentina, Uruguay, and Spain. He's the author of 12 books, some of them translated and published in Spanish, Arabic, and Chinese. Among his works and on Spain and books on Federico García Lorca, Ernest Hemingway in Spain, popular Spanish culture and the Camino de Santiago, Roads to Stars to Santiago. He was called the best book on the subject by the New York Times. Stanton's environmental novel, Wide as the Wind, the first to treat the tragic history of Easter Island, won 4 international prizes. And his latest work, Vidas, Deep in Mexico and Spain, is the first travel memoir to portray the 2 most popular Spanish-speaking countries in 1 volume, written with the perspective of an American and the knowledge of an insider. Thank you all for following us via Zoom, Instituto Cervantes New York's YouTube channel and Instituto Cervantes New York's Facebook. For those who would like to ask questions, don't forget there's a chat, there's a Q&A. You should sort of register via Zoom, and you can ask all the questions for Antonio Muñoz Molina to answer. We will have time at the end of the event for a Q&A with the audience, you, who are also the very, very special guests. With no further ado, I'd like to give these 2 gentlemen the floor. Antonio, Eduardo, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. Antonio, it's a privilege and delight for me to have this conversation with you because it gave me the opportunity to receive an advanced review copy of your very powerful translation of your novel, To Walk Alone in the Crowd, the translation of the Spanish novel that came out 3 years ago, Un andar solitario, entre gente. I know that your novel was translated into French last year, but I think there's a real kind of poetic justice that it's now appearing in New York with a marvelous publisher for our Strauss, because you have lived in New York, you have worked in New York. A lot of the book takes place in New York, and you did some of the field work for this book in New York. When I say field work, I use the term almost in the way an anthropologist or an archaeologist would, because as our listeners are going to learn, you did some arduous preparation for this book. In addition, some of the authors that you discuss are Americans: Edgar Allan Poe, Walt Whitman, Melville, Emily Dickinson, or a Spanish poet like Federico Garcia Lorca, who lived in New York also. I don't want to claim the book for New York and the United States only, because your novel also takes us to other large, important cities in the history of literature. Madrid, London, Dublin, Paris, Berlin, and the writers who lived and worked in those cities: Baudelaire, Walter Benjamin, Dickens, Thomas de Quincey, Fernando Pessoa, I forgot Lisbon, and Madrid. It would be really hard to try to categorize your book because it's, I believe, quite experimental. I think it really pushes the limits of all genres. I think we might call it a novel, but it's a novel, again, that is really different, unique, and hard to categorize. So instead of trying to categorize or describe your book, let's jump in and start with first things first, the title. And you lifted the title, or stole the title, from a great poem by Francisco de Quevedo, the Spanish Baroque poet. It was a love poem. And in one interview in Spain, you said that the title of the book in Spanish, Un andar solitario entre la gente, we translated in English as a lonely walk in the crowd. You said that the title crystallized the work in progress. Could you tell us how the title did crystallize for you that work in progress?
Thank you for your question and for your reading of the novel, which is a novel. And well, the thing was that I have always read this poem by Quevedo, who is also he's at the same time inspired by a different poem by the great poet, the Portuguese poet Luís de Camões, no? Andar solitario, entre gente, no? And what struck me about this line in the poem, which is also a beautiful poem in itself, this single line sounds completely modern, no? Because you imagine in the 17th century, no, the experience of walking alone in a crowd, it seems like an absolutely contemporary experience, no? It's the experience that you find in the Quincey or Poe or all the great flâneur or urban writers, no? But you find this whole experience crystallized in a single line in a poem written in the 17th century. The poem must have been written in Madrid, and you imagine that Madrid in the 17th century was little more than a village, no? So this feeling of being, this absolutely modern feeling of being alone in a crowd, which looks like a line by Baudelaire, it struck me as a kind of vision, as a foresight of the future, no? of the contemporary condition of people living in the solitude of the big cities, no? And it is so beautiful, no? The line is so beautiful. It seems to demand a book to be written.
Right. The English title, To Walk Alone in the Crowd, unfortunately, is not a poetic line from a poem by Shakespeare or by an Elizabethan poet, which would have been marvelous, right?
Yeah.
To find an equivalent. But I think for an American or an English-speaking audience, it has some echoes or resonance that the original title doesn't have, and that is the idea of the lonely crowd. There was a very famous sociological study published in 1950 by David Reisman called The Lonely Crowd. And if people in the crowd were lonely in 1950, or if Quevedo felt lonely in the crowd in Madrid in 1640, what about us? How lonely do we feel, right? We feel loneliness to the 10th power as each of us walks with our computer screen or a phone in front of us. And at one point you described the people in New York as, I think this is a city of zombies glued to cell phone screens, of invisible men and women.
Yeah.
So this sense of solitude among the crowd that you're talking about, I think is exaggerated, is hyperbolized. You know, it's even more powerful now in our time, and that's one of the great themes of your novel.
Yeah. It seems that, but you know that to be alone in the crowd can also be a very positive experience, no? And this is something that I try to show in the book, no? I mean, you are isolated, you are alienated in a crowd, in an unknown city, but at the same time, you can enjoy yourself and you can infinitely enjoy the spectacle, the show, the permanent show of the city, no? And this is the celebration that was stressed by people like Baudelaire, no? Baudelaire said that to be alone in a crowd, to walk in a city, is like being a prince going incognito, no? And you can be alone, but also you can explore and enjoy solitude, no? I wanted the book is a novel for a number of reasons, as you said early on, no? And it's a novel mostly because at the heart of the book there is an absolutely imaginary character, no? There is a kind of ghostly presence that I seem to have met in Madrid at the Café Comercial, no? And there is this feeling of, for me, coming from a peasant childhood, no, and having arrived to Madrid and to big cities, to New York, when I was young, no, there was an exhilaration. There was a happiness. There is this wonder of looking at people, of turning your gaze to everybody and to anybody, and finding stories all the time, no. So this is a mixed feeling. You have mixed feelings about the city. On the one hand, you are isolated, you are lonely, but if you only pay a little attention, this loneliness becomes a very cheerful solitude, because you have the chance to watch people, to see stories in the faces of people, not to learn to pay attention to conversations, no? I mean, you go on the subway, you know, the New York subway is such a place to enjoy the human condition, no? Unless of course, you are glued to your cell phone, you're not paying attention. But otherwise, I mean, the city is an unending show going on all the time, no? And that was also part of my intention, or of my drive while I was writing the book, no?
Yes, that's definitely true, because most of the book seems to be a kind of assault on the senses by the world of consumerism. The constant presence of signs, advertisements, lights, posters, handbills, also fragments of a conversation, fragments of songs. And I'd like to read for the readers a few of the many, perhaps more than 100 short titles for each one of these sub-chapters in your book, because
Okay.
they kind of structure the book and they give it a flavor. And let me read a few to give the listeners a sense of these chapter titles. Live your day without limits. Multiply your happiness. Be the star of your own movie. Put your money where the miracles are. Get your smile back with a 3D printed jaw. Quick, cheap divorce and paperwork, 1 hour. Dogs can sport the newest fashions too. You may not see us, but we're here. And the one that's a favorite of many readers, be yourself unless you can be Batman. So what these subtitles have in common, besides the marvelous humor, that even you're enjoying yourself, right?
Yes, I was absolutely enjoying myself.
Yes, and the book it does have humor, even though there are many somber parts about the book. All of these commands, they are commands, so that the dominant grammatical mood of these titles is the imperative, the single you, the single person. But the speaker is an anonymous we, a kind of collective, right?
Yes.
You may not see us, but we're here. And we see you really is the kind of subliminal message that these subchapters suggest, right? So can you talk a little bit about the process, the arduous work, almost like an archaeologist or an anthropologist, as you walk through cities with your tape recorder, your telephone, your notepad, your pencils, recording and taking notes that eventually would become a novel?
Yeah. Well, it all started by this obsession to pay attention to all these ads that I came across while I was walking in the city. No, it was a time I was working on a different project. No, but then I have always been fascinated and also enraged by the omnipresence and of the language of publicity, of commercials, of ads. No. So because they steal from poetry, they steal from songs, no, and were the only intention of making you buy things, no. So when I started jotting down all these ads, all these things that I came across on the street, no, with no further intention, it was only for the sake of it, because I could not do it, no. So little by little, I started to realize that there was among all this confusion, there was a unity. There was a kind of a common voice, no? And this was this voice of command and invitation at the same time, no? It was a voice, it used the you, it addressed you as a poem does, no? You are the, and it was pointing a finger at you, no? It was saying what to buy, what to say, inviting you to desire things, no? And since they were using the language of poetry, there was also a kind of beauty in it, no? So I remember I was in New York one day, no? And I pay attention to something that we see all the time in New York. If you see something, say something. And I said to myself, this is what I want to do. I say something, I see something, and therefore I say something. So the whole book came out. It was not something I planned ahead. No, it was something that came to me while I was doing this thing in first in Madrid, then in Paris or New York. I was just simply jotting down things, no, paying attention to ads, to headlines in newspapers, all this kind of stuff. No, the stuff that surrounds us, but we don't pay attention to. But it's a kind of pollution. It's something related to environment, and I know you are very sensitive to this, no? So this is a word which is flooded by garbage, no? By plastic garbage, but also by visual and verbal garbage, no? But in the middle of this garbage, you can find like a hint of poetry or beauty, no? Sometimes because they previously have taken these things from beauty, from poetry, but also because there is an involuntary poetry. No, this is, and this is something that I learned from the writing in the early 20th century. You remember how Joyce used the ads in Dublin papers, no, and in Ulysses, how many different people have done that, no. Painters, no? A painter I particularly love is Stuart Davis, no? Mm-hmm. I'm particularly fond of Stuart Davis, no? And he paid so much attention to all these ads, these letters in the middle of the city, no? And it was so exciting to put all these things together and see that something might come out of that, no? it was like working with the refuse, these materials was refuse materials, and you could make them into something, no?
Right. This has to do with the art of collage, of course, you know, which you
Yes.
say is at the foundation of modern art starting in the early 20th century, where the artist takes objects that in themselves are worthless or even trash, right? Refuge, and puts them together and creates something that has some kind of value. So the art of the collage is something that's very alive in your book. The cover of the English translation is a sort of collage. The frontispiece of the book is a collage that you've done yourself. The Spanish edition has even more collages that you yourself have done. And you touched on many things. I want to go eventually to the whole environmental theme in your book. But I did want to mention that even though this assault on the senses by the commercial world, the urge to consume, to buy this, buy that, take this vacation, take this cruise, take out this mortgage, buy this house, etc., is a kind of pollution. You have found in it some kind of poetry. And I think there's another mechanism at work, and that is you take a visual image, let's say a video or an ad at an airport about Estee Lauder handbags, jewelry, or makeup. And by converting a visual image or video into words, it takes on a new strangeness and a new kind of beauty.
It becomes a narrative.
It becomes a narrative, but it's a narrative we pay attention to because we're not used to having someone who is an anthropologist like you copy and observe every detail of that video that may last, what, 60 seconds, right? And so let me read an example of this. I want to read this one passage. It's an Estee Lauder ad about a woman who's walking through the city and everything is turning red, maybe because it's for a red lipstick or whatnot. But it's an example of this kind of this technique you use, which I think is wonderful. But it must have cost you a lot of time and trouble to do, right? A woman in a red business suit and red heels walks magically through a city as if she were floating, impelled by a breeze that quickens her step without ever lifting her entirely off the ground. She steps off the sidewalk, and the white stripes of a zebra crossing turn red beneath her feet. A glowing Estee Lauder red, the same red as her shoes, blazer, handbag, and lips. She walks under a tree, and one by one, its leaves turn red as well, as does the spreading shade on the pavement. That's absolutely beautiful. And yet, if we were at an airport and we saw that ad, we'd look away because we've seen so many of them in that medium. But what you've done is transform the medium and give us a sense of strangeness, of distance, that I think is wonderful.
Oh, thank you. And also we have to never forget the wonderful translation by Guillermo Bleichmar, no? Because the passage you just read, it flows beautifully in English, no? So this is something that we have not to forget, no? Yes, this is what lies at the heart of the book, no? To pay attention to the things that are right in front of you, but that nobody pays attention to, because we are too used to them, because they are so omnipresent, no? So many things are happening in front of you that you are not paying attention to. And what happened to me at the time I started writing the book was that I had the feeling of opening my eyes up and opening my ears as well, no? That's why I went eavesdropping in conversation, no, on the bus, no, and there were subjects like jewels, no, I found. I remember one particular example I enjoyed a lot. It is a guy was speaking on his cell phone, no, with someone, no, and he said, do you really put this? Are you wearing this precisely to speak to me? No, did you put this on just to speak to me? And I said to myself, what the hell is happening here? No, what's the story? What did she or he put on in order to be ready for this conversation over the phone? No? So there are so many, there's people, when you are young, you think that poetry or literature lie beyond the realm of the concrete or of the prosaic, no, or the ordinary things, no. But I think that little by little, you realize that the real treasures, the real beauty lies in front of you. You don't have to go abroad to find these wonderful things, no. That they are happening in front of you in an ordinary sidewalk in Madrid or New York, no.
I remember some other very interesting snatches of conversation you overheard, and I think overhearing is important. You didn't hear them, you overheard them because they weren't directed directly to you. And I think it was John Stuart Mill, believe it or not, who defined poetry as a conversation that is overheard. Not heard,
really?
but overheard. In other words, from a distance, the subtlety, the distance, the silence, the whisper, right? I remember another snatch of a conversation you had, I believe you heard someone say, she claims that the most important thing in her life are her fingernails. Right? Her priority in life are her fingernails.
Yeah, right? Her absolute priority in life were her fingernails.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly. So your book, in addition to being a novel, with some characters who, however, do not interact with each other very much, is also, I think, a kind of literary history of the writer-walker, of the flâneur, the writer who, starting in the early 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, with the growth of modern cities, with the use of gas lighting and later electric lighting, it was possible for people to walk safely in the cities. Men, not women, because if women walked alone in the cities, we have the perfect word in English, they were streetwalking, right?
Streetwalker, yes.
Means a prostitute, right? But however, you will deal with some women writers eventually in the book. So you talk about this kind of literary history of this genre of the literary walker, and Poe in New York, who seems to be one of the earliest ones, right? And then Poe is translated by Baudelaire, and Baudelaire is another walker in the city who observes, as you've already mentioned. And a fascinating fact that you mentioned is that apparently Baudelaire, one of his friends said, did not compose his poems seated at a desk, but composed his poems as he walked through the streets.
Yeah,
and somehow the rhythm of walking.
That's the testimony of a friend of Baudelaire, yes.
Right, yeah, exactly. And after all, there's nothing more natural for a human being than walking. We were made to walk, right? Our ancestors walked out of Africa. That's how we got to Asia and to Europe and eventually to the Americas, right? And the walker also has a gaze that sees farther than four-legged animals, right? Sees farther. And your book is a book about another walker, you, or the narrator in the book, right? Who sees everything at eye level and everything with the rhythm of the walk. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I've always been fond of this genealogy of the writer-walker, no? Because you mentioned that this is an extraordinary genealogy because it is perfectly straight, no? There is no interpretation here. There is no doubt, no. So Poe read the Quincey. Poe read the Quincey's confessions of the opium eater, no, and he wrote this extraordinary piece of narrative, which is The Man in the Crowd, no, which every time you read it is more astonishing. Because it is so modern, no? It is a short story, but there is not a plot. It is only someone who is having coffee at some place and starts following someone else. And the whole story is simply the description of this long walk over 24 hours in a city, no? And the fascinating thing is that Poe places this story in Paris. He had never been to Paris, no? But then Baudelaire translates the Quincey and Poe into French, and he starts the whole tradition of the flâneur in France, no? But later on, in the 20th century, Walter Benjamin translates Baudelaire into German. And then he moves to Paris, and he becomes a walker in Paris himself. And then, and the fascinating thing for me, what made Walter Benjamin such an incredible character for me was that he was planning to move to New York. He might have been living in New York. He might have been living in the same neighborhood I was living in for many years, no? Right. Because he was about to become part of the German emigre Jewish community on the Upper West Side. No, he was planning. He had a map of New York City, and he pointed everything that his friends wrote to him about in this map of the city. No, so he had his visa to the U.S. No, he was trying to learn English, no, by reading Faulkner, by the way. No? And so when I was writing the final section of my book, no, I was aware that someone who might have been walking around the same neighborhood I was so familiar with was Walter Benjamin, no, much right. as Federico Garcia Lorca had been also strolling in the very same neighborhood I was living in. No? So I felt myself in the middle of a community of walkers, no? Some of them living and some of them dead. No, it was like the living dead, the walking right. dead.
Yeah, and of course the tragedy of Walter Benjamin is that he imagined living in New York, but he was killed in Spain, right?
Sure.
At the French Spanish border. So
yeah,
I like the way you evoke, you imagine Walter Benjamin living in New York, right, and walking down the streets of New York.
Because he might have loved so much the city.
Yes, he would have loved living also, right?
yeah, yes, of course.
Yes, huh? Yeah. I think all of these men that you mentioned, and I say men because they are all
obviously.
Men, because it was very hard for women to walk alone in the city to find this freedom. But in many ways, all of these walker writers found their greatest freedom on the street, in walking and observing and annotating and writing about what they saw. But I think we also should remember that you discuss some other literary walkers like Virginia Woolf and her character, Miss Dalloway, walking through the streets of London, buying flowers. And for me, one of the most moving cases is when you talk about Emily Dickinson, who is famous for not being a walker, famous for not leaving her house. But as you say, where she felt the freest was in her own house, in the same way that Poe felt the freest walking the streets of New York or Philadelphia or Baltimore, or that Baudelaire felt free walking in the streets of Paris or of Brussels, or de Quincey walking in the streets of London.
Well, you know, there are two, in my opinion, there are two kinds of artists, no? Those who are the artists of the expansive form, no? Or the expansive life, no? You think of Whitman, no? No, the whole world seems to be opening up in front of him. No, he seems to be embracing the whole experience of life. No, and on the other extreme, you have Emily Dickinson. No, the artist who concentrates. It's like the way Thelonious Monk played piano, or the way Art Tatum did. No, Art Tatum displayed all his virtuosity, no, all over the keyboard, no, and Thelonious Monk concentrated on a few notes, no, very sparingly, no. So this is the two types of artists, no, and we have to pay attention to both of them, because the artist who loves the street sometimes has to go back to the desk and sit down and do his writing, no? And the writer who is alone, who is isolated in his studio or her studio, has to find the whole universe, no, inside this bubble, no. You see that when you read the Emily Dickinson's poems about nature, no, he is describing a small garden, but you see how she writes about a worm, no, or about a bee. No? So it's like the jungle. It seems that she has the whole possession of the jungle in her back garden. No, so both types of artists are fascinating to me. No?
Yes, of course. I would like to read a few passages, very short passages from the book to give listeners a sense of your style and the variety of your style also, and the brilliance of it. And the first passage I'm going to read has very much to do with your methodology in preparing to write this book. I almost never ride a bicycle, and I never take a taxi. I either walk or ride the subway. All my worries and obsessions are dissolved in ceaseless observations. I am no longer my own thoughts, the things that I imagine or remember, just what meets my eyes and ears, a spy with secret mission to record and collect all. A much briefer passage. Milk and coffee come together in a kind of Eucharistic mystery. So do bread and butter, quince and cheese, bread and olive oil. The things that artists made with their hands from cheap materials and bits of junk, the things they cared for and preserved through lives of poverty and grief, are now trophies for billionaire investors, gleaming like gold ingots in crypts of bulletproof glass. Here's Donald Trump with his gold Lex Luthor hairpiece, misgoverning the world like a megalomaniacal villain out of a cheap novel, a Goldfinger, a Dr. No. And the last passage I want to read will be familiar to anyone who's been in airports in New York and in Madrid. As soon as you step outside an airport terminal, you notice a country smell. The arrivals hall at JFK smells of fast food, fried grease, hot pizza dough. The first waft of early morning air in Madrid carried a Spanish smell of tobacco and coffee with milk. That's wonderful. Wonderful. Antonio, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the structure of the book, and especially the tour de force, the long second part, which takes its title from a line by Emily Dickinson, Mr. Nobody, because all of us walking in the city are Mr. Nobodies. All of us glued to our screens. We're all, lonely in the crowd. So in the final section of the book, you undertake this epic walk, this epic journey, which in the book is one walk. I suspect that in your life or the narrator's life, it was several walks put together.
Yeah.
Because
Indeed.
who can walk from the south of Manhattan to the South Bronx in one day and survive and record?
Excuse me, I've done it. I'll
Right.
tell you later, please.
Okay, but you didn't have time to take notes, right?
Yeah.
And as you do this, the goal that you reach is the House Museum of Edgar Allan Poe in the South Bronx. And as I read this, I thought of a book by the American travel writer Paul Theroux called The Old Patagonian Express, where he takes trains all the way from Boston to Patagonia, but he stops in Buenos Aires to interview Jorge Luis Borges. And Borges tells him, don't go to Patagonia because there's nothing there. Just stay here in Buenos Aires where everything is, right? But so there's a sense of disillusion that Theroux feels because the goal, Patagonia, turns out to be something that Borges despises and discourages him from seeing. In your book, after this long walk with all the obstacles along the way, and the crowds, and the people, and the potholes, and the beggars, et cetera, you reach Poe's house, and it's a poorly funded house. They have no budget to keep it up well. You're the only person, the narrator is the only person there. It's a lonely, sad place. The guide is someone who is probably Dominican. You wonder what his link or his connection to the English language, to American literature might be. And so there's a sense of disillusion, a sense of disappointment, a futility that almost represents the end of Poe's life, because he lived there very much toward the end of his life. A life, as we know, that ended badly. And at a time when he was also struggling with alcoholism, the death of his wife, drugs, poverty.
Well, there is a sense of dissolution, but it's also a sense of accomplishment, you know. And for me to create this long walk, no, all the way from South Ferry up to the Bronx. In the first place, this is something I've done a number of times. No, I have taken walks from South Ferry all the way across Broadway, all over Broadway, through 242nd Street. No, it takes you 6 hours. No, and you stop for a for a snack, but it takes you on the whole 6 hours walking. No, and it's like the sense you design this trip. No, you decide you see the trajectory on the map. No, and you see and you think that you're going from A to B. No, so you go across the whole, you cut across the whole life of the city, across all the different nations, countries, lives, businesses. No, so you get to the end of it, and on the one hand, it obviously somehow disappointing. No, but on the other hand, it is a kind of an accomplishment. No, I have done it. I have seen the very house where this man lived. No, I've been here. No, and there is a moment when the character, the nameless character, who is the other protagonist of the book, no, he simply seems to fade away in the crowd. No, because I must tell you something. Throughout the book, there is a thread that has to do with the depths of depression and coming out of it. No, I mean, when I wrote the book, I was coming out of a long period of depression. No, and what happens to you when you are depressed is that you don't pay attention to what surrounds you. So your eyes are closed. No, and for me, this coming out of depression meant that I was opening up my eyes and also fleeing away from myself. No, depression is a case of being obsessed with yourself, or not being able to get rid of yourself 24/7 hours. So there is a kind of Zen accomplishment. No, a kind of, this is a journey, a kind of Buddhist journey. No, from the personal identity to the moment when identity dissolves. No, in the crowd, in the pure observation of people and things. No, so there are both two sides to this. No, and also I love the fact of bearing witness to the whole of the city. No, to embrace, to encompass the whole of the experience of the city. And because at the time it was a time when I was saying a farewell to the city as well. Mm-hmm. I was about to leave the city for good at the time I wrote this second section. No, so little by little it became a kind of elegy to my life in the city.
Mm-hmm. Oh? Very interesting. Yes, and let's talk about that farewell and the departure, because after you accomplish this task of walking the city, let's say, you realize it's time to go home, and you go through the horror of all airports, or the narrator does. All airports are the same. They're all terrible. You fly from New York to Madrid, and this return home has to reminded me of the archetype of all journeys that end with return home, namely the return of Ulysses to Ithaca, to his island, to his home, to his wife, his family, his soil. In your case, the return, very different, but you leave behind the noise of airports, of cities, this pollution, this verbal, this oral, visual pollution. And the novel almost takes on a different kind of pace or rhythm, much slower, much more reflective. Noises disappear, the voice becomes much more interior, and you reach home. So instead of reaching an island, you reach an apartment.
Well,
The narrator reaches an apartment, right?
yeah.
Yeah. And yet the feeling is one of tremendous relief and of peace. And of course, the encounter with the partner. And after all of this time of observing others without touching, and you said at one point, there's something strange about a human body that does not rub or touch other human bodies. There, instead of noise and the pollution of noise, instead of distance and separation, there's the human touch, which seems to redeem everything that you've gone through. And for me, it redeems everything you've passed through, and is a wonderful, very moving, extremely moving, and almost end of the book.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, this is, I was fumbling my way along. No, I was making up as I went along, because I didn't have a very clear idea of how the book will develop. No, how it will turn out in the end. No, so I didn't have a plan. You have to bear in mind that I didn't have a clear plan very much well into the book. No, I was very far into the book when I finally found out a possible outcome, no, a possible ending. No, so it happened when I was alone working in New York. No, I went to New York in February 2017 at the time of the beginning of the presidency of Donald Trump. No, and my wife and I, we had been living through the campaign and the election in November, and we were very much affected by it. No, I think that sometimes much more than some of our American friends. No, because they took for granted democracy and stability, and I thought that they were not scared enough of what Trump will bring. No, so what happened was I was planning to finish the book, so I planned to. My wife was in Madrid, and I went to our apartment in New York for 2 months, just to give the finish to the book, to find the final form. No, so while I was there, while I was writing, I found this final resolution. No, what will happen, and something I found as well was that the book could not be finished until I got back to Madrid. So the return becomes a part of the book. No, so I had planned to finish the book in Madrid, but while I was there, I finished the book in New York. But while I was there, I realized I had to go back to Madrid in order to find the ending of the book. No, so it came out naturally. It was a natural denouement. No, and well, the thing is, you need a refuge. We all need a refuge after living in this strange, very strange and noisy world. What kind of refuge can we find? Each of us needs this refuge, this island, no? and this island of silence and human touch, no, as you very well has stressed, no. So it was a natural ending, almost ending for the book, no. This coming back home, finding your partner, and finally enjoying silence and intimacy.
But you had to leave home in order to come back home, in order to find that refuge, right? Because other parts of the book also take place in Madrid, right?
Yes,
when the narrator has to leave his house, he's looking for a new apartment. So there are other scenes in Madrid. And I think in the literary history of the science that you have created, which is ambulologia, or ambulatology, or perambulation studies.
Perambulating studies. I love perambulating studies. Yeah.
Right. I think Antonio Muñoz Molina will be remembered as the flâneur par excellence in Madrid, right? Because you not only tell the history of other walkers and writers in Madrid, like Galdós, but you yourself walked the city. Then you traveled to Paris, New York, and whatnot. And that's what made the return home possible, right?
Yeah.
As Nietzsche said, you need to go abroad in order to understand your own country. I know you've been back and forth many, many times, right? But in the structure of the book, it's the return poem that gives that sense of relief and of peace and resolution at the end.
Thank you so much. No?
Thank you, Antonio. And I think it's about time to turn it over to Richard to see if there are questions on the chat.
Let me tell you, I'm so grateful for your reading of the book. You know that we write books and we expect people to read them in full. No? I mean, we are like composers. No, we will love someone to listen to each and every note we are writing. No, and it is a pleasure and a relief to feel that you have been fully read, no? And fully understood. Thank you so much for your wonderful reading of the book.
Thank you for your marvelous writing of the book.
And thank you both for the amazing and scintillating evening or afternoon that you've given us. Yes, thank you. Your timing, Edward, was brilliant. I've got a couple of questions from the audience. And don't forget that after this presentation, this enchanting evening, we are going to have this uploaded onto our YouTube channel, and we'll be able to provide you with the translation and the dubbing and the right language for everybody to delight themselves in English and in Spanish. I've got a couple of questions for you, Antonio, not for me, from the audience. Let's see how you enjoy answering these questions. The first one is, after devoting so much time to dissecting the art of commercial collage in the streets, what differences or similarities can you see in the way these work in English and in Spanish in terms of rhythm, syntax, message, content, etc.? It's a complicated question for you, Antonio.
No, it's not. It's quite a simple question. It's very similar. I mean, there are no great differences. This is universal language of command and invitation to the fulfillment of unending desires. So whatever, it's like walking through an airport. You know, you see all the screens, no, and the screens are the same screen all over the world, no. And this is why it is so disturbing, no? Because you can be in Dubai or in London or in Granada, and you see the same images, the same videos, the same headlines, the same commercials, no. So sadly, I have sadly to report that there are no great differences between the garbage, the visual and verbal garbage in the US and in Europe or Spain.
Okay, here's another one for you. How well will "To Walk Alone in the Crowd" age? Will it mean the same thing to generations to come? Or will it be a foreign language or concept in 20 or 30 years' time?
Well, you never know. This is always what we are. We never know what will happen with the things we do. No, and this is something that sometimes people are worried about posterity or what will happen with their work. No, and you will never know. We will never know what will happen with any books. No, I remember a wonderful book by Cyril Connolly called I remember the title now. No, The Enemies of Promise. No, and the book was written in 1938. No, and the intention of the book was to try to write a book that would last for 10 years, because Cyril Connolly said to himself, most books have completely disappeared after 10 years. So let's try to write a book that at least lasts for 10 years. No, and he more or less succeeded.
Okay.
So who knows? No, many things we were talking about Emily Dickinson. No, when she published 2 or 3 poems while she was alive in her own lifetime, and the poems she published were anonymous. There was not her signature with the poems that were published in newspapers. So who knows? And I must tell you something. To care about that is silly. The only thing this is a very uncertain profession, and maybe it's a far stretch to call it profession. This is a very uncertain job, no? So the only certainty you can have as a writer is, this is what I want to do right now. I'll try to do my best. I'll try to bear witness to the time I'm living in and the places I'm living in. So and this is the only thing you can do. What will happen next? You never know, because many great successes have become oblivion after a few years, and many forgotten or never known writers have turned out to be wonderful masters. No, so I really don't care.
Well, I don't know if you care or not, but you must be doing pretty well, because you do know that you've got two great articles that have been published today in Wall Street Journal and New York Times, and a few more things that are coming out now. So well done, Antonio. You've got another question that's just coming in from Marta Luaces now here, and she says, thank you for a wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you how the experience of New York changed the way you experience and live now in Madrid.
This is a very good question coming from Marta. No? Well, a friend of mine, a New York friend of mine, said to me, "What are you doing in New York so many years?" And I said, "I'm giving myself an education." No, I went there to flee Spain, in a sense, because I was becoming too well known in Spain. So I was in the danger of becoming a kind of institutional cultural figure. No? So I had to flee. So I went to New York, and I stayed in New York for this reason many years. And what I was doing was to give myself an education in distance from my own country. You know, to see my country and Europe from New York and the US, no? To give myself an education in the language, in the writing, in the way, in prose writing. For me, prose writing in English and in the US, it is an important lesson to be learned.
Right, you go.
For a Spanish writer, no? Mm-hmm. So, and I enjoyed myself the whole time. No? I learned so much about. I wouldn't have never been able to write this book without the experience of so many years going to exhibitions in New York, without seeing art in galleries, without experiencing the contemporary culture the way you can experience it in New York. No, so I got myself an education, and now I must report that this is the part of the city that I miss the most. No, the excitement of looking up on the New York Times on Friday, the weekend, and seeing the listing of the things going on in the city over the whole weekend. No, the opera. As you know, Richard, I love many different things. No, I have many different passions. So where should I go? So that's
Antonio,
what I miss.
The best thing, Antonio, is that not only that you love the things, but you can express them, and you can facilitate them to people that are not acquainted and familiar with them, like opera and jazz. I mean, I've learned so much from reading your articles, your novels of jazz, history, politics, and opera, of course. Yeah, so that's again another example of your generosity, explaining these things so beautifully and so artistically. So yes, thank you very, very much. Another very quick question has just popped up. Do we have time? I think we've got 2 more minutes. So
okay.
Ooh, there we go. It's a long one. Let's see. When did you start doing the research process for this book, given that you lived in New York years ago, and how has this city influenced you as a writer? Goes on, it says, do you have any routine as a writer before you set out to write, in terms of doing research for a certain period of time, or writing a certain number of hours a day, etc., etc.? So it's about your craft and your art, Antonio.
Well, I didn't do any previous research for this book. No, I just started getting obsessed by ads and by things. You know, I just started by jotting down things and taking notes, and it was so unexpected for me that, in fact, I was writing a completely different book at the time this one came along and imposed itself on me. I was writing a different novel, but I got bored with the book I was writing, and I got absolutely enthusiastic about all this garbage, you know, that I didn't know what would I do with it, no? So there was no research. There was only a passion. There was only curiosity. It was a sense of play, no, a sense of enjoyment.
Right. Mm-hmm. That's good. And there's another question popping up now in our YouTube channel, and it's from Geraldine McLean. There is quite a difference in the places that have inspired your work, New York or Madrid, compared to your home, Úbeda. how would you say the space that inspires you impacts on your writing?
Well, this is the whole story of my education as a writer and as a person. No? The fact of being born in Úbeda and living till the end of my teenage years in this small town, and then going to Granada and Madrid and on, and always going back, and always, I mean, this tension between the origin, between the belonging to a place where you were born, and the worldwide world, so to speak, and the experience of being born in such small town in the late 50s and become an adult in a completely different world. This back and forth between Úbeda and New York and Madrid, and this back and forth between the past and the present is at the heart of my writing and of my personal identity.
Good. Okay, I think we have to bring this to a close now. I just have to thank, first of all, let me thank Antonio, obviously I mean, it's such a pleasure and such an honor to have you here with us. I have to say, for those of you who haven't read it, please don't miss the excellent reading that To Walk Alone in the Crowd makes. Remember, it's published in the United States by Farrar, the House of Books, Farrar. And of course, I would also like to thank Edward for an amazing partner in the concocting all these beautiful questions for Antonio that made us all sit at the edge of our seats. So it's this enchanting evening has been amazing. We will be able to re-see it and analyze every word you've said, going back to our YouTube channel and our Zoom channels and Facebook channels in Instituto Cervantes in New York. Again, Un andar solitario entre la gente, To Walk Alone in the Crowd, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Thank you very much, Edward. And of course, thank you for our guest of honor, Antonio Muñoz Molina.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
It was like coming back home.
The other home.
the other home. There are many different homes.
Right.
And thank you, everybody who's been listening and sending in the questions. Don't forget to read it. Bye-bye.